So we're here to look now at the first group of the Refuseniks series, which is called Courage to Refuse. And we're also going to look very briefly at the Refuser Solidarity Network. As I have already mentioned in the previous set of slides, making the comparison between Yesh Gvul and Courage to Refuse, this was a movement sparked by the publication of the so-called combatants letter, signed by 50 combat officers and soldiers, and this was an initiative that was started by Captain David Zonshine and Lieutenant Yaniv Itzkovitz. The time was 2002, so we are in the middle of the second Intifada. And here at this address, this internet address, you can find the combatants letter that I've just mentioned. You can find it there, and I think it's important to read some passages together to gain a sense of the tone, first of all, and of the attitude of these soldiers, how they portray themselves, and how they state very strongly their position. The letter opens like this, and I quote, "We, reserve combat officers and soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces, who were raised upon the principles of Zionism, self-sacrifice and giving to the people of Israel and to the State of Israel, who have always served in the front lines and who were the first to carry out any mission in order to protect the State of Israel and strengthen it. We, combat officers and soldiers who have served the State of Israel for long weeks every year, in spite of the dear cost to our personal lives, have been on reserve duty in the occupied territories and were issued commands and directives that had nothing to do with the security of our country and had the sole purpose of perpetuating our control over the Palestinian population. We, whose eyes have seen the bloody toll this occupation exacts from both sides," and so on. But most of all, it says, "We who sensed how the commands issued to us in the occupied territories destroy all the values that we were raised upon. How the price of the occupation is the loss of the IDF's human character and the corruption of the entire Israeli society. We who know that the territories are not a part of Israel and that all the settlements are bound to be evacuated, we hereby declare that we shall not continue to fight this war of the settlements. We shall not continue to fight beyond the 1967 borders in order to dominate, expel, starve and humiliate an entire people. And we hereby declare that we shall continue serving in the Israeli Defense Force in any mission that serves Israel's defense. The missions of occupation and oppression do not serve this purpose, and we shall take no part in them." So, as you can see, this is a very, very strong statement signed at the time by 50 combat officers that by now, 2015, have become 623. But what is interesting here to note, and I encourage you to browse the website, starting from maybe the letter that we just read, it's there on their website, is that the members of this movement do not object to their being drafted or to being called to fight a war that would mean embracing weapons, embracing arms again, and shooting again, but in order to protect the state. But there is a or their families or society. But there is a very, very strong realization here that the occupation is not part of the state's interest, is not part of is not carried on. It doesn't work in defense of the interest of Israeli society. On the contrary, it works against its interest, and therefore these 50 turned 623 members of Courage to Refuse object to carrying out any service in the occupied territories. Of course, there were consequences for there always are consequences, as we have already seen for the objectors in the 50s. There were consequences for these objections, and over 280 members of Courage to Refuse were court-martialed and jailed for periods of up to 35 days as a result of their refusal. And in case you're interested in this particular organization over the others, I really recommend reading this book by Ronit Chacham, Breaking Ranks, Refusing to Serve in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, published in 2003. Now, if we look at, for example, the question and answer, the frequently asked questions that you see on the website, these are the questions are almost more interesting than the answers, because they try to anticipate the questions of someone who would ask really banal questions that almost trivialize the experience of and the courage, really, of these officers and combat soldiers. Just to give you an example, apart from the standard questions, why are you refusing? But refusing is illegal. How can you justify your act? This is one of the questions that is asked in the frequently asked question. And what would happen if everyone were to refuse in the territories? Or would you justify soldiers who refuse to evacuate settlements, pointing to the argument that if conscientious objection is legitimate, then is legitimate also for those soldiers who would refuse to carry out orders that they consider unjust if these orders were to evacuate the settlements. And it's actually interesting to read the answer to these questions. So, would you justify soldiers who refuse to evacuate settlements? And the answer here is, not all refusals are similar. We are not automatically in favor of anyone's right to refuse any order that they don't like. Each and every case must be looked at individually. Our refusal is intended to uphold values that lie at the foundation of the State of Israel. Israel defines itself as a democratic state. A refusal to evacuate settlements arises from values that are not part of the democratic agenda. For instance, the sanctity of the land. We therefore oppose to this kind of refusal, although that does not necessarily mean that we think that such refuseniks should be forced to act against their conscience. So, the question that aims, that tries to put the refusenik in contradiction, or to point at his moral dilemma vis-a-vis his comrades. For example, while you refuse, your friends and comrades go on serving. How do you feel about that? And the answer here by Rami Kaplan is very bad, because we don't want them to serve in the territories either. This is what we are fighting for, but we cannot do things that go against our conscience, harming millions of innocent people simply because our friends do. And so on. More interesting is the idea that you cannot only object to certain orders, or you cannot simply refuse to carry out illegal orders once you are in the territory, because, as Yuval Andorn, one of the refuseniks here, says, because the illegality is built into the situation. From the moment that we crossed the 1967 border, we have no choice but to treat every human being as an enemy. We have no choice but to discriminate between Jews and Arabs. We have no choice but to take part in the occupation, which is immoral by definition. So despite the fact that these refuseniks, or these combat soldiers, speak the language of the consensus, because they are very mainstream. After all, they are soldiers who are gaining their legitimacy from the fact that they declare to be ready to go back to fight, but not in illegal situations. There was another letter that was published in the same 2002, which is the so-called the pilot's letters, which is very, very similar to the combatants' letters that I just read you earlier on, only it was signed by helicopter and fighter jets pilots. I think you should, I mentioned this in the previous slides, there is an interview with Jonathan Shapira, a radio interview that is listed among your links, and I think it's important for you to listen to what he has to say. It's a little bit long, it's about an hour long, but maybe you want to just start listening to what he has to say as to the reasons of this such a mainstream objection or a refusal. Last word to Elik El-Hanan. We'll encounter this activist over and over again. He and his family are all a group of activists in various fields, in education, in refusal, and so on. And he's also among the founders of an organization called Combatants for Peace that we will see at the end of this set of slides on refusers. And he's also one of the signers and a member of Courage to Refuse. And while Combatants for Peace is a joint Israeli-Palestinian organization and therefore is perceived as much more mainstream, Courage to Refuse is described by El-Hanan as a normal, mainstream, middle-class group, which gives to the other more radical, if you want, Refusnik groups, but also the other groups of activists, the advantage of being, of having some impact on an altogether quite standardized public opinion in Israel. So despite the very strong arguments that you always can hear in the country. I think that in closing, I should also mention the Refuser Solidarity Network, whose slogan is the Israeli refuser movement ending the occupation one soldier at a time, that really functions as a network, in fact, that builds support and seeks to increase the visibility and educate the public about the Israeli refuser movement. Jonathan Shapiro, that I just mentioned earlier, is part of this, and not by chance. He tried to increase the visibility of the movement by going and speaking to the radio, for example, in the U.S. But you can find on the internet many conferences or initiatives promoted by a students group in various American campuses and universities that invite members of one of the various Refusnik movements. So this really what the website is really maybe the most important tool of the Refuser Solidarity Network, with the exception, of course, of the people who do their activities live. And I think that in the section resources, there are a number of links and of connections that are worth pursuing if you're interested in this topic. So with this I close and I move on to the next two organizations of conscientious objectors or refusers. Thank you.